Okay, this is Module 15 of Unit 3, Populations, Generalist and Specialist Species, K and R selected species, and survivorship curves. Today, our learning goals are identify the differences between generalist and specialist, describe the differences between K and R selected species, and explain survivorship curves. So, in this module, we will describe how populations change over time in reaction to a variety of ecosystem factors, including the impacts of and differences between generalist and specialist species and how each excels in specific types of habitats. We'll also identify the differences between a case selected species, which tend to be longer lived and provide intensive parental care, and R selected species, which tend to have shorter lifespans and provide little to no parental care. And then finally, we'll explain what survivorship curves are and what that means for different organisms. So recall that in Unit 2, organisms have a preferred range of survival, just like you guys have a preferred hot and cold, rainy and wet. Organisms do as well. Species that exist under a broad range of conditions are called generalists. So, in general, they can survive in a lot of places. And species that exist under a narrow range of conditions are considered specialists. They have a specific thing that they need. So, for example, generalists would be in the range of green here, so they can survive, grow, and reproduce in this range, and then kind of as we go out, survive and grow, and then survive. Specialists, though, they're going to be right in this red area, and they don't like to get out of it. Makes them very susceptible to invasive species coming along and disrupting their lifestyle, and disease running through there, or famine, etc. So they're very sensitive to changes in their environment. Yeah, generalists are in organisms that have a wide range of tolerances slash environmental conditions or their ecological niche. They can eat a lot of different things. They can live in a lot of different habitats. Examples, they say raccoons, bobcats, coyotes. So those are things that you see across the United States from New York to California and everywhere in between. They generally are what make up our invasive species because they can adapt to pretty much anything. Um, Such as like rats are really good at being fine with whatever is around. So when rats are involved, they typically become an invasive species. In Missouri, we have the zebra mussel. I don't remember exactly where the zebra mussel comes from. I think it's somewhere in the south, and somebody brought like a boat along, and it had a zebra mussel on it. And the waters in the south are probably a lot warmer than our waters here, but the zebra mussel did not care, and it took over. Okay, specialists are organisms that have a narrow range of tolerance or environmental conditions or an ecological niche. They have a specialized diet. They have a narrow habitat range. For example, these are endemic species such as koalas, lynxes, and pandas. So they generally do not like change and are very susceptible to becoming endangered or threatened if something happens in their environment that would cause that. So if all the eucalyptus trees in Australia burn down or a big forest of them burn down, likely we would lose koalas as well because they're just not well adapted to live anywhere else. So we're on to our second standard. Describe the differences between K and R selected species. So as the population grows, scientists consider the population growth rate or the intrinsic growth rate of a population, the number of offspring an individual can produce in a given time period minus the deaths of an individual or its offspring during the same period. Scientists also consider the maximum potential of a population to grow under ideal conditions. That's called the biotic potential. So remember, living is biotic. So what's their living potential? The species are either labeled R selected or K selected to describe their growth rate. That's not exactly true. It's kind of a spectrum. Some animals you'll have, or organisms you'll have, very defined roles. So, what are those roles? So, K selected species tend to remain around the carrying capacity of the population, which means they abide by the resources around them. R selected species tend to live by their biotic potential, meaning as they don't abide by the resource, they tend to have as much offspring as they can. And some species may have characteristics of both growth rates. Like I said, it's a spectrum. So here's a quick table of the different um, things that you could use to identify whether it's a K selected species or an R selected species. So typically, K selected is going to have a longer lifespan. They're going to have longer time to reach reproductive maturity. They have a not as many reproductive events. So that means they don't have as many children. They when they do have children, it's not that many at one time. The offspring tend to be larger. Um, their growth rate is slow. Their population seems to be pretty density dependent, but pretty stable. And so, density dependent, if you remember from the last unit, is it depends on the resources around them, etc. Competition for resources is usually pretty high because their populations are stable and they are going to rely on those resources. And then impact of invasive species typically can be pretty high because they take a long time to go on to the next generation and evolve. When I think of K selected species, obviously I think of humans because our lifespans tend to be pretty long in the animal kingdom. Most people don't have more than two or three kids, um, and they don't have a lot of them at one time. Their offspring tend to be larger, so that doesn't mean that they're larger than the parents. It just means that they're larger than like frogs. Okay, parental care. So we get raised until we are 18, 19, sometimes later than that. Our growth rate is pretty slow. It takes you a long time to develop into your final formation or what you look like, right? Um, our population regulation does not typically depend on our resources because we're humans, but you can imagine what that looks like, right? Population dynamics seems pretty stable, and we're trying to get to figure out what our carrying capacity is on Earth. Most mammals probably fall into this category right here. So, case selected, they use their energy and their resources to try to get their young to more reproductive years. Whereas on our R selected, okay, their lifespans are pretty short. The time to reproductive maturity also does not take that long. Number of reproductive events. So this is kind of confusing. So make sure you're tuning in. So sometimes they have a lot of reproductive events because they're just trying to get as many babies out as they can. And sometimes, since they don't have a long lifespan, they may only have one. Number of offspring typically tends to be a lot. The size of the offspring are pretty tiny, and then they typically don't care for them after they are born. The population growth rate it spikes a lot, so it goes up and down because they reproduce a lot. But also, not a lot of their babies typically make it to maturity. Their population regulation, your book says, is density independent, but you're still going to have things where they might run out of space, or if they don't have enough resources, they'll die off in greater numbers, which means that they have a high variability, so they can spike a lot. Okay. Uh, since they spike a lot, sometimes there is competition for resources, sometimes there isn't. And then they have a low impact from invasive species because they have the ability to change a lot more rapidly. Their evolution does. Here, I'm thinking of frogs. I'm thinking of rats. I'm thinking of bacteria. I'm thinking of bugs. I'm thinking of grasses, etc., etc. Okay. There are some gray areas or some spectrums in between. So, like an oak tree, right? So, an oak tree takes a long time to reach sexual maturity, but it has a lot of reproductive events every year. You're dropping acorns and you're dropping a lot of them. Um, so, that's one that I would consider in the middle. Um, Turtles typically have lots of eggs, so that would be somewhere in the middle, right? But they don't really hang out with them after they're born, etc., etc. So uh, don't try to fit it just in two categories. You might have some that fit exactly in this category or exactly in the other category, but you're going to have a lot of organisms that are kind of right in the middle. So our selected populations tend to grow large and fast and then may die only to grow and die again. This is known as the overshoot and the dieback. So our carrying capacity is always going to be probably right here for our resources. Notice how there's not any values there. This is just a graphic or an image. So the population skyrockets, it overshoots the carrying capacity and then dies back down. And what will happen is it'll come back here and then it'll keep going up and down, up and down, up and down like that. Because of these commonalities of population growth, species tend to have distinct survival patterns. These survival patterns can be represented in a graph that shows survival of species as a function of age or survivalship curve. Okay, we're on explain survivalship curves right here. So you have type 1 survivalship shows high survival over time and large numbers of death at old age. Survivorship 2 shows there's relatively constant decline over the entire lifespan. And survivorship 3 shows high death rate at early in life with few individuals reaching adulthood. So let's take a look at what one of these looks like. So type 1 is a lot of people make it through, or a lot of organisms make it through the early stages of life, but as they get older, they die off rather quickly. Um, Survivorship 2 means doesn't really matter how old you are, you're probably dying. And then survivorship 3 means that not a lot of people make it to the mature part of life, but when they do, they typically hang on for a long time. So our case selected species typically are going to be 1 and 2. Again, if you notice, those are both mammals. Humans would be a type 1. So most of us make it to adulthood, and then as we age, we tend to die pretty rapidly. And then squirrels are mammals, so unfortunately, squirrels they have a lot of things going against them, so they tend to die at any age. And then our selected species tend to be not a lot of them make it out of maturity age, but when they do, they tend to live for a while. And that is your module 15 lecture. Let me know if you have any questions.